Most men don't lose because they are incapable. They lose because they stop. Too early, too often, too easily. They start with intensity. Motivation is high. Energy is strong. Everything feels possible. And then reality hits. Fatigue, resistance, discomfort. And that's where they break. Not because they can't continue, but because they're not used to enduring. That's the difference. Success is not built on who starts stronger. It's built on who lasts longer. Most men are trained to seek relief. When things get hard, they slow down. When pressure rises, they step back. When discomfort appears, they look for escape. And over time, this becomes their default pattern. Effort to discomfort to stop. Repeat. That pattern destroys potential because everything valuable requires sustained pressure, strength, money, skill, respect. None of it comes quickly, and none of it stays if you can't endure. The man who wins is not always the most talented, not always the smartest, not always the fastest. He is the one who stays in the fight when others leave, because most battles are not decided by skill. They are decided by who refuses to quit. Endurance is not impressive. It's quiet, repetitive, often invisible. And that's exactly why most men ignore it. They chase intensity, big effort, fast results, visible progress. But intensity fades. Endurance stays. The man who can keep going when nothing is exciting anymore has an advantage that compounds because most people don't last long enough to see results. They quit in the middle. Not at the start, not at the end. In the middle, when it's boring, when it's repetitive, when there's no recognition, that's where the real filter happens. And that's where most disappear. The man who stays in that phase wins by default, not because he's better, but because he's still there. Endurance is not about pushing harder, it's about not stopping. Even at 60%, even at 40%, even when everything feels slow, you continue. That consistency creates separation. While others reset, you accumulate. While others rest, you progress. While others wait for motivation, you move. And over time, that gap becomes massive. Skill improves. Confidence stabilizes. Results appear, not suddenly, gradually, quietly, inevitably. The man who endures doesn't need shortcuts because time starts working for him. Pain is the separator, not talent, not intelligence, not opportunity. Pain, because pain reveals limits. And most men have very low tolerance. They avoid discomfort. They escape pressure. They stop at the first sign of resistance, not because they are weak by nature, but because they train themselves to avoid pain. Comfort became the default, and comfort kills endurance. Strong men are different. They don't chase pain, but they don't avoid it. They stay in it longer than others. That's where advantage is created. Because in every competitive space, there is a moment where it becomes uncomfortable. Business, training, learning, life. That moment decides everything. Some slow down, some quit, some look for relief, but a few stay. And those who stay start separating, not because they're faster, but because they're still moving when others stop. Pain tolerance is psychological dominance. It means you can operate while others shut down. You can think while others panic. You can execute while others hesitate. That's power. Because in pressure, the one who remains functional controls the outcome. Most men break before they reach their limit. The man who wins finds out where his real limit is, and then moves beyond it. Talent creates fast starts. Endurance creates lasting wins. Most men overvalue talent because it's visible. They see someone perform well and assume that's the reason they succeed. But they don't see what happens over time. Because time is where talent gets exposed. Talented men start strong. They move faster. They learn quicker. They get early results. But when things slow down, When progress becomes harder, when effort becomes repetitive, many of them fade because they relied on natural advantage, not on resistance, not on discipline, not on consistency. The man who endures doesn't care about starting fast. He cares about not stopping. And that changes everything. Because over time, consistency compounds. Small efforts stack up. Daily work builds momentum. Repetition builds mastery. And slowly the gap closes. Then it reverses. The talented man slows down. The disciplined man continues. And eventually the one who stayed longer becomes better. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but permanently. That's the power of endurance. It doesn't win instantly. It wins inevitably. Here's the final truth. You don't win because you're the best. You win because you're still there. Most men leave early. They exit the process before it pays. They stop when it gets slow. They stop when it gets hard. They stop when it stops feeling worth it. And that's why they never reach anything. Not because they lack potential, but because they lacked endurance. The man who wins does something very simple. He stays. He stays when it's boring. He stays when it's painful. He stays when nothing seems to be changing. And that's when everything starts changing. Because time rewards consistency, not emotion, not intensity, consistency. Every day you stay, you move forward. Even if it's small, even if it's slow, even if it's invisible, you're still progressing. And that is what most men don't understand. Progress is not always visible, but it is always happening when you don't quit. The man who endures doesn't need perfect conditions. He doesn't need motivation. He doesn't need recognition. He only needs one thing: to continue. And that alone separates him from everyone else. Because quitting is common, staying is rare, and rarity creates advantage. So the question is simple. Can you stay when it's not exciting? Can you continue when there is no reward? Can you endure when everything in you wants to stop? Because if you can, you don't need luck. You don't need shortcuts. You don't need talent. You will win. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because in the end, the man who stays is the man who wins. This is Disobey Your Limits.